My name is Jonah Whitcomb. I'm 29 years old. The night everything I'm about to tell you began was October 13th, 2018, a cold, moonless Saturday that smelled of wet leaves and old wood smoke. I say that first because dates matter in truth. They anchor memory the way a compass needle finds north when everything else spins. I'll tell you up front, this is true. Every ache in my chest when I talk about it is true. The names I use are real people I knew, though I've changed a couple to keep some of them safe from the attention that truth sometimes drags along. I was reckless, stubborn, and proud in the way only a man who thinks he's 3 sizes bigger than his fear can be. That pride nearly cost me everything. Let me set the scene before I get to the dark. The Appalachian stretch I'm talking about isn't the tourist-smoothed Blue Ridge Parkway. This is the older side of the mountains where the roads thin to gravel and the mapmakers use dotted lines for trails that locals swear exist and hikers swear don't. A place called Hollow Ridge, by people who live there, though on topographic maps it's just a cluster of ridgelines and hollows between the Kentucky state line and the Tennessee border. The town nearest us was Quails Hollow. 1 grocery, 1 church, 2 bars that were the same bar depending on who was keeping count. I was one of those YouTube documentary types back then. Small channel, modest following, voiceover with a cigarette voice that made ordinary facts sound ominous. I chased local legends for views and, selfishly, for the rush. You get addicted to going where others won't. People call it courage. Most of the time, it's a selfish little thrill wrapped in a microphone. I wasn't alone that October. With me were 3 people I'd known since college. Ben Holloway, not related to the Hollow Ridge Holloways, though the name made him a local joke, a lanky EMT with a nervous laugh, Marcus Lane, who could gut a trout by moonlight and never use the same pan twice, and Owen Kessler, who'd inherited his grandfather's beat-up camper and an odd, patient face that made small children ask him questions. None of them were soft. None of them believed in ghosts. All of them believed in me. We had a reason to be there besides a good story. A woman named Evelyn Crow, late 70s, stooped like a question mark and twice as prickly, had contacted me after she'd seen a short on my channel about abandoned mountain hollers. Evelyn claimed there was something in the hollow behind her property that had taken things. A hen, a trapline, once, if you believe the whispers, a cow. She wanted proof, she said, and she wanted us to understand what she'd been living with for 20 years. She handed me a folded letter with shaky handwriting and a string of photographs from the early 1990s showing strange clearings and stones with white markings around them. My job, as I declared to my camera, was to go and find the truth. That was the plot of it, the clean outline before the watercolors smeared. The characters, by design, were ordinary. A stubborn, widowed woman who smoked Camels and kept the lights off at night because she swore the thing didn't like being looked at. 4 men who laughed at being called brave and wanted to see something that would make their nights feel earned, and a mountain that seemed, on maps and in town, to fold inward like a secret. People in Quails Hollow had names for places no map acknowledges: Raven's Throat, Widow's Shelf, the bottom of the world. And we learned them the way you learn a new language, by mispronouncing it until someone corrects you with a bitter smile. A bitter smile. Before I get to the blood and the silence that followed, you should know how each of us moved through the world. Ben was the kind of man who flinched at sudden movements because he'd seen too many ambulances at 2 a.m. He kept a pocket Bible he never read. Still, I think he read people like scripture. Marcus was practical, a man who would sleep on the truck's tailgate and wake with a grin because of the sunrise. Owen was the quiet kind who held a flashlight like it was a holy relic. Me? I liked to narrate. It made danger into something neat, something with a beginning, middle, and end. It's easier to control fear when you can give it a sentence. We drove up county roads that day with coffee and packed lunches, the sun slung low and the radio playing songs older than any of us. The hollow Evelyn pointed out wasn't far from her trailer, a thin trail that disappeared into laurel and oaks. Her property backed against a strip of national forest, and somewhere beyond that, the mountain folded into private tracks and logging roads. The hollow itself sat like a bowl and breathed cold air out the same way a cellar does. Evelyn's tongue clicked every time she said its name. Don't go after dark, she told us twice. Not if you don't know how to look. We promised her we'd be back before dark. We promised the sort of things men promise when they mean only half of them. The first 700 words were, I hope enough to let you breathe. They are the measure of normalcy before the thing that makes sleep thin crawls through a story. Here is where the main story begins, where the lights go thin and the mountain starts to get its claws into you. We reached the clearing just after noon. Leaves lay thick like a carpet, damp and spongy. At the edge of the clearing, a ring of stones sat half-buried, each with a smear of something white on its face. The same pattern Evelyn's photograph showed. Up close, the marks weren't paint. They were streaks of calcified residue, like lichen that had learned to spell. Owen wiped his glove across one stone and his face tightened. Whatever it was, it flaked beyond anything normal. I set up the camera near an old stump and we did the ritual introductions the internet loves. Jonah Whitcomb, documentary. Ben Holloway, EMT. Marcus Lane, outdoorsman. Owen Kessler, camper. And the camera ate our words like a polite witness. The microphone caught the ordinary sounds first. The wind in the laurel, a distant dog baying, a woodpecker tapping as if to a private rhythm. Then, a little after we started walking the perimeter, when the sun had flattened into a softer, more suspect light, the air changed. You notice small things first. A dog won't come near the ring even though a stray had followed us in until now. A spider, suspended on its web, moves from one side of the web to the other as if to inspect the intruders. My compass needle wobbled. I remember because I joked about it on camera. I said, Hollow Ridge can't decide which way north is, and the joke landed like a pebble in a deep well. Owen found a set of prints in the mud near the ring. Not deer hooves, not bear paw, not human. The toes, if you could call them that, were long and tapered, like the fingers of someone who'd learned to climb without branches. We laughed. We recorded the laugh because that's what men do when the edge of something sits at their feet. They try to make a sound that will fit into the world they know. By 3 p.m, the light had a greenish quality. Shadows under the pines were too black, like holes cut with a knife. Then, Marcus found the trap. It was a simple steel snare, half hidden in the brush, rusted but functional. They set snares in that part of the mountains, sure, but this was wrong. No one from Quail's Hollow set them this high up, not after what Evelyn said. The trap had been placed with care, aimed into the clearing, and in the middle of the clearing, a small pile of corn and bone-white millet lay arranged on a flat stone. The arrangement suggested intention, like the hand of someone who liked symmetry. Ben picked up a tiny bone, as if to taste it, and then put it down with a look that made my skin feel like it was pebbled. We should leave it, he said. We should mark it and take photos and go. That was when the whisper started. At first it could have been the wind, but then it spoke a syllable that we all knew in our bones. A name. Not Evelyn's name, not any name I recognized, but something that sounded like a call from an old tongue. Ben froze mid-step, and the hair along his arms stood like a row of tiny soldiers. Owen's flashlight knocked in his hands, and the metal clang echoed in the hollow in a way that wasn't right. Marcus shrugged as if to say he heard nothing, but his jaw moved the way it does when someone swallows a grudge. A smell rose then, not of rot, but of something older, a tang like iron and Wild's burbs burned together. The camera bobbed on its tripod as if it wanted to run. The forest made a long exhale and the temperature dropped. You notice how fear comes in textures, a sound, a smell, a hair lifting on your neck, and then, inexorably, the understanding that certain things are not meant to be known. I thought then of the stories Evelyn had whispered about the place when we'd sat in her trailer. How, when she was a girl, people left offerings at the edge of the hollow, and how things had been taken as payment for favors. She had said once that the mountain remembers the debts you assume on its slopes. We had laughed at that too, like good tourists. But facing the ring with a spring in your chest and a camera battery running out is different than hearing it in a trailer with coffee cooling at your elbows. I moved closer to the stone with the pile of millet. My hand hovered above it, and the hair along my forearm bristled. It felt wrong to touch, like touching wet paint that would never dry. I reached out with the camera lens because the camera gives you courage, or makes you braver than you are, or possibly stupider. When my fingers brushed the millet, a sound like a curtain being torn came from the inside of the hollow. A slow, skein-like tearing that made all the nearby birds go quiet. The ground beneath my boots hummed. Then the ring's white marks steamed like breath in cold air, and a figure moved at the far edge of the clearing. It wasn't a person entirely. If I had to name it, I would say it wore the suggestion of clothes and had length where shoulders should be. It moved like something made to fit the hollows, bending to the slope of the earth. For a long beat, no one spoke. Marcus reached for his knife. Ben took the Bible from his pocket and gripped it like a talisman. Owen's hand held the flashlight steady. The thing tilted its head as if listening and then, with a motion that was more thought than muscle, lifted one hand and pointed directly at me. That's where I will stop for now. I can still taste the cold iron of the air from that moment. I can still hear our breaths and the way the hollow held them. I won't write what came next here. Not yet. If you want to know how a man's voice can fold and break in a place that eats promises, tell me you're ready. I'll tell you the rest. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I remember the point of the finger like a photograph burned into memory, pale, long, as if whatever pointed had too many joints. When it aimed at me, the air between us seemed to change density, like stepping from summer into deep water. My rational brain tried to file it under explainable. A trick of light, a deer hunter's jacket caught on a branch, but the rest of me felt something older and animal. Ben whispered my name. Not the camera script of my name, but the low, sudden way people say words when there's no more room for ceremony. He said, Jonah, and it wasn't a question. His hand found my shoulder, and it was ice. Don't touch it. I laughed at him, because laughter is something you can hand out when you're nervous, but it was thin. The camera rolled on its tripod, a small cylinder spinning in the mouth of the hollow and eating our fear like a witness that had to record everything. I heard the faint click of its recording light, steady and indifferent. The figure took a step. The movement had no weight to it, like watching a shadow try on a shape. When it shifted, the leaves it passed didn't rustle. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. I should have fled then. We should have all fled, should have put the space of that ring between us and whatever it wanted. Instead, the kind of arrogance that got me attention online, the belief that stories are something you can hover over and document, kept me standing. It spoke without sound for the first half second. Then a voice came that wasn't voice so much as language translated by the bones. It made my teeth ache. I felt something like a needle of cold go through my skull. The thing said plainly, "Keeper." Nobody said anything for a long, stupid second. Then Marcus laughed too loud, the kind of laugh that tries to scatter tension and only tightens it. He stepped forward like someone pushing at a fence to see whether it will give. "What the hell is that?" he said, and that question was a cliff. The creature raised both hands then, palms open. Not threatening, but like a midwife offering a newborn. It moved with such slow deliberation that time felt sticky. "It recognizes you," Owen said, his voice thin. He sounded uncannily like Evelyn had when she spoke of offerings. "It knows a debt." "Debt," I echoed. I hadn't known I owed anything to a hollow. Ben's mouth moved. For a second I thought he was reciting psalm numbers the way some men do when prayer is their reflex. Instead he said, "It said my name." His eyes were wide and very wet. "It said Marcus's name. It said yours, Jonah. It said..." He stopped. He couldn't finish. He wouldn't. Marcus's laugh died. He swung the knife in his hand and the blade caught the light in a scream. "This is ridiculous," he said. "It's some hillbilly trick. Someone's messing with us." We looked for a human face that could be pulled from behind the laurel. There was no one. The hollow offered only the long, patient dark between the trunks and the ring of stones with their white smears. The pile of millet sat on the stone like a tiny altar. Something about it felt like bait. I made the stupidest of choices. I reached for it. Not because I thought the camera would get a good shot, though I told myself that, but because the finger that had pointed at me seemed to have accused me of knowing something. If you tell a story for a living, you believe you can touch the thing that scares you and not be eaten by it. I put my hand over the pile. The sensation was immediate. It wasn't pain so much as a translation. It felt like someone pressed a photograph into my skin, A child's small hand, a winter moon, a rope taut around a pole, a laugh that wasn't my laugh, another man's hands. Hands older than anyone I knew. Organizing seeds in the dark. The vision overlapped with the real world until I couldn't tell the edges. The hollow closed in like an eye. Ben screamed. Not the cinematic scream of movies, but something raw and broken. He dropped to his knees and held his hands to his ears like that would damn the sound. From the corner of my vision, Marcus lunged for me and his shoulder slammed into my ribs. The impact wrenched the breathing out of me, and I fell backward onto the wet carpet of leaves. The camera lurched, and the lens caught nothing but sky and a streak of dark as someone passed over it. When I blinked, time had moved forward in a messy way. The kind of blur where seconds knuckle together and you can't be sure which one you are in. Ben was on the ground near the ring, his face livid with color. Marcus was standing over him, shouting about, "What did you do, man?" Owen had his torch aimed at the ring, as if light were a weapon. The figure was gone. Then I noticed the prints. Another set, smaller than the ones near the stone before, leading away from the ring in a shallow arc, like someone who'd stood, turned, and walked on tiptoe. For a second, for an instant so fast that it didn't feel real, I saw Ben's boots at the center of that arc. But his boots were where they'd always been, in the mud, soaked and dark. Ben's mouth was open, making a wet sound. He reached toward Marcus, and his fingers were long and trembling like a man's who hadn't slept in weeks. He kept saying the same thing over and over in that panting, half-laugh, half-prayer way. "It wants the story. It wants the telling. You have to tell it. Tell it right. Leave a piece." "What does that even mean?" Marcus demanded. He sounded like a man mentally cataloging actions he could take. "Did it hurt you? Did it—" Ben's eyes snapped like a camera shutter. He pointed to me, and with a clarity that felt unreal, he said my name and, "You promised." "You promised what?" I asked, and it came out thin. That afternoon fractured into small, sharp pieces. We argued until our words had the texture of stones thrown through a window. We searched the tree line with flashlights, the beams making thin cylinders of certainty, and then nothing. We found scrapes on trees, the bark torn and hung like skin. We found small piles of animal bones, cleaned and arranged, but nothing like the human-made pattern the ring suggested. We found a child's knit cap snagged on a limb, the color faded to the same gray as the low sky. The cap might have been left by a passing kid, it might have been left by time. Everything could be explained. Everything could not. As dusk bled into evening, that particular Appalachian twilight where the world seems to fold inward and shrink, our choices narrowed. Our cheap headlamps threw rings of light that didn't reach as far as they promised. The camera battery was down to one red bar. Ben had started muttering again under his breath, words that sounded like fragments of old songs and something like the names of trees. Owen refused to leave the ring. Marcus wanted to go back to the truck and drive until the world looked like the kind of sane place where you could get a burger and laugh about nonsense. I wanted to get footage. I wanted to be the one who could look into the camera later and say, "Here is what we found." Evelyn's warning, "Don't go after dark," circled me like a hawk. I felt its talons, felt how wrong we'd been to promise. The mountain, in its slow and patient way, didn't need us to understand. It only needed us to remember. We left the ring at twilight, the stones like teeth in the dark. No one wanted to touch the millet again. No one wanted to speak of offerings. We carried Ben to the truck. He didn't walk. He clung to us like a man afraid of falling apart. In the cab, under the orange street lamp light of the truck's dome, his eyes rolled, and he kept whispering a list of things he said we owed, to places, to people, to the mountain itself. He said names none of us knew. On the way back across the gravel, a sound followed the truck, a slow, deliberate tapping that matched the rhythm of the tires and then fell away into the sort of silence that fills the space behind your teeth. Marcus swore, and Owen slowed. I watched the ring in the rearview mirror until the glow of our taillights made it a smear. That night, in the trailer Evelyn had lent us, while she tried to decide what a sensible person should do with people who'd seen something they couldn't explain, we huddled over coffee and cheap whiskey. Ben sat with his head between his hands. Marcus hadn't eaten. Owen smoked someone else's cigarette and didn't speak much. The camera battery died. We turned it off like you turn off a small animal that is wounded but still twitching. For the first time in my life as a storyteller, I felt like the story had turned on me. Tomorrow, Marcus said finally, his voice flat. We go back at first light and we finish this. We document it. We prove her wrong or right. Either way, we're done. Ben looked up. He had a look on his face like a man who had read a page he didn't want to read. You don't finish it, he said. It finishes you if you don't leave a piece. You have to leave something for it. We all laughed then, but it sounded brittle. We said things to steady ourselves, jokes, plans, but the hollow's weight sat on our shoulders like wet coats. None of us slept well. I dreamed of the ring that night, the stones, the millet, the long-jointed finger-pointing. I dreamed of a ledger where names were written in the white smears and crossed out slowly like a hand going through a list. I woke with the aftertaste of metal and the memory of the figure's voice in my head saying a single word that somehow made sense and did not. Keeper. In the morning, we would go back. We would do what we always told viewers we did. Confront the thing that hides in plain sight and make it a shape you can hold in a frame. We would tell the story right. I hoped we were brave. I hoped we were stupid. I did not know which hope would save us. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The sun came up like something that had been hesitating all night and finally decided it had to do its job. The mountain was a different animal in daylight. Edges were sharper, shadows shorter, and the world seemed to offer explanations for what the dark had whispered. We packed silently, moving like men who had rehearsed being normal and found they didn't remember the lines. Ben kept glancing at his hands as if expecting to find a blistered map written there. Marcus hummed under his breath, a tune I'd heard him whistle in college when he was trying to pretend nothing bad could happen. Owen checked the camper's gas and tightened every bolt until his knuckles went white. I don't like this, Ben said finally, the words coming out like a cough. His voice had a fringe of exhaustion. It keeps asking for things. You don't bargain with that which remembers. What do you want to do? Marcus asked. He sounded tired of fear and impatient with caution. The truck started, and the motor inhaled the cold air. We went back the way we'd come in. The gravel swallowing the tires, the truck's headlights making toothy shadows. Evelyn watched from her porch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of pipe tobacco and lavender. Her eyes were hollows themselves. She had that look of someone who'd traded sleep for vigilance long ago. She'd made coffee and left it in a thermos on the stump near the foot of her steps. No one drank it. At the clearing, the daylight fell differently. The ring of stones looked less like teeth and more like the remnants of something older, a woman's jaw that had stayed when everything else had shifted. The millet pile was gone. Whatever had been removed at dusk had been removed properly, with care. A breeze slipped through the laurel, but did not ruffle the white smears. They glowed faintly like old bone. Ben knelt and pressed his palm to one of the stones. He closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was small. We leave something, he said. It wants a piece. Not meat, Jonah, not like that. A piece that proves you remember, an offering of memory. Memory, I asked. The word tasted of smoke. What does that even mean? He opened his eyes and stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You told it the last time. You promised to tell what you saw. It doesn't want things. It wants to be remembered right. It wants stories told in the right order. Leave a piece of your truth. It will take it and be satisfied. I thought of the camera battery. Dead, like a heart that had stopped for a reason. I thought of the viewers waiting for something to watch and the click of a subscribe button that had fed my pride. I thought of Evelyn's insistence in Ben's older, careful hands. At last I said, fine, we tell it. We tell it the way it wants. We framed it like research. Marcus made a list of facts. Who we were, what we saw, where the stone ring was, how the maze had been placed. Owen argued for ritual, a circle of salt, a candle, something neat and human to keep an animal at bay. Ben refused the salt. Salt draws attention, he said, and it's not tidy stuff we're dealing with. So we did it the oldest way we knew how. We told the hollow a story. Ben started with a small thing, an old woman's name, the way to whistle to call a hound, a farmer's name that had lived and died in the county. Owen followed with a memory of a childhood storm and the smell of his father's wool coat. Marcus, deep-voiced and blunt, told a tale about a fox he'd once trapped and then released because it looked at him like a man in a mirror. I told mine last, a small thing about how I'd once lied on camera and called it research, how I'd once broken something and buried the truth for an audience. When I finished, the hollow did not answer. For a long moment, there was only the wind and the batteries of the world clicking like a clock. I felt foolish, like a child who had recited a prayer and then waited for thunder. Then the ground hummed, not a tremor, not the polite shiver of an animal walking past, but a deep, low note you feel in the mouth. The stones flared white, and the patches of residue steamed. In the distance, something like laughter rolled. Not human laughter, but an echo of breath and wood and old things remembering. And then the hollow spoke, not to one of us, but through us, as if the things we had said were beads on a string and someone pulled. Keeper, it said. The voice not in our ears, but in the place behind the eyes where memory sits. You name, you keep. It was a compliment and a command. The ring answered to names like a bell answers to touch. The words settled into me like a seed. We left something then. Ben took an old pocket watch from his jacket and placed it on the flat stone where the millet had been. The watch was cracked, the glass like a cataract. It belonged to his grandfather, Ben explained. He had never wound it. Marcus left a small brass whistle he'd carried at camp. Owen laid down a scrap of a map with a creek he'd found when he was 10. I put nothing on the stone because what could I offer? My camera had shown me things. I had learned to tell them and trade them for clicks. I tried to place a truth on the stone, simple, messy, the kind that would matter, but my hand hovered and fell back. Ben pressed the watch into the stone with both palms. For a second, a ribbon of air came up like steam. The watch clicked, then stopped, and the white smear on the stone took a shape like a tear. Ben looked up at me and smiled with too many teeth, and for the first time since we'd arrived, his face looked almost peaceful. We left the clearing slow and quiet, like a family leaving a hospital room. The truck rolled down the gravel as if the road itself had agreed to lead us away. In the cab, Ben talked of small things. Recipes, the exact coordinates of his favorite fishing hole, the name of a woman from his college days who had once lent him a coat. He said them like an offering, as if the hollow demanded more than one item. The cadence of his voice eased the knot in my chest. By noon, we were back at Evelyn's trailer. She nodded at us as if we'd done something sensible and also something stupid and primitive. "You left a piece?" she asked. We told her what we'd done. She cupped a cup of coffee in both hands and looked at the truck like it was the only honest thing on the road. "Good," she said. "If it's given you its name, then it's marked you. Keep the mark well." "Mark?" Marcus repeated, glancing at his sleeves. "What mark?" Evelyn's smile was a blade. "Not all marks show skin. Some show in how you sleep, how your tongue holds a truth, how the world leans toward you. The mountain doesn't just take, it chooses." That night, sitting around a table that was too small for 4 men who had seen too much, the smallness of ordinary objects comforted me. A plate of eggs, a tin cup, the sticky tag of canned corn, these things anchored the world. Ben fell asleep in his chair with the watch in his hand. He'd wound it once and then set it down. He snored in small, polite bursts, like a man who could still trust his chest to the mechanics of breath. At 2 a.m, I woke to a sound like pages being turned in a heavy book. For a moment, I couldn't place it, whether it was the wind, a truck, or the folding of some large animal. The trailer smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Ben was asleep with his mouth open. Marcus and Owen were gone. I went outside because the world seemed too close to hold. The air was sharp and the stars were pinholes in a cloth. Owen's truck was gone. Marcus's boots were missing from beside the door. On the side table where the keys lay, there was a scrap of paper with a hastily drawn map and a small circle marked, the pen's ink pressed deep. Someone, probably Marcus, had decided to go back. I shouldn't have followed, but I did. The woods that night were different, not because the hollow had changed, but because I had changed. My skin seemed too thin. My throat carried the taste of iron. I followed the map Marcus had left, a small trail that veered from the main road and ran down into the bottomlands. The moon was a silver coin held between trees. I found them at the stream where the map ended. Marcus was crouched at the water's edge, his hands in the shallow current, staring at something glinting beneath the surface. Owen stood behind him, his mouth a hard line, the flashlight in his hand steady as a prow. Neither of them looked at me when I arrived. Marcus had a grin that was too wide for the light and too not his. "Thought you'd be asleep," he said, glancing at the dark ring under my eyes. "Figured I'd come find my courage when the night had it on credit." "What are you doing?" I asked. Marcus held up his hand, and in it lay a coin. Old, worn, stamped with a face I'd never seen. In the coin's nicks were lines that looked like the white smears in the ring. "We picked it up downstream," he said. "Been floating like a small memory. Thought maybe we'd pay it. You know, leave something where the hollow can't reach." Owen's voice was flat. "Some things you can't pay for with money." Marcus chuckled, but it had a metallic edge. "Ben said leave a piece. I thought this might work." The stream burbled like an audience. For a heartbeat, it looked like any other country night. Two friends with pockets full of useless coins. Then something moved in the shallows. Something that made the surface tighten and skitter the way a mirrored pond does when a stone goes through it. The coin in Marcus's hand warmed like it was living. The face on it seemed to turn. And then Marcus looked at me with a look that was no longer all his own. His eyes had a way of holding mine, and for the first time, I saw the whiteness under his irises like a mistake in glass. He did not speak. He only smiled, and in that smile, the mountain lived. "You promised," he said slowly, and the words rolled like a stone in a throat that was not clean. "You promised we'd tell it right." "You promised?" I echoed, because the room felt to be shrinking, and a ledger was opening, and a line had my name on it. Marcus threw the coin into the stream. It sank, and the water closed around it without a ripple. The stars blinked. The creek made a small, satisfied sound. Owen took a step back, and in the space he made, the trees leaned in like an audience. Something had changed. I felt it in the soles of my feet, a pressure that readied, a waiting. Marcus reached out and touched my arm with fingers that were warm and firm and not quite human. "Keeper," he said in that same hollow voice. "Keep the telling." I felt then a small, cold pinch on the inside of my wrist, like a coin pressed into flesh. When I looked down, there was a line of whiteness under my skin, faint but there, like the smear on the stones. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to wake someone and say, "This is ridiculous." But there was a part of me that knew that whatever had begun at the ring had put an account under my name. The mountain had accepted something I couldn't see and had given me a mark. "Come on," Owen said abruptly, like a man trying to stitch a secret seam together. We left the stream with the taste of the water still on our lips. We walked back to the trailer, footsteps loud and slow. Marcus hummed the tune he used to whistle when he wanted to choke off the world. I slept with the mark under my wrist like a small, cold secret. In the morning, Marcus was gone. No note. No boots. No sign he had left except for the faint trace of footprints toward the creek that ended as if someone had been lifted. Owen said he had gone to smoke and never returned. Ben sat at the table, his watch stopped, and the face dim. He was quiet in a way that suggested he had given everything he could and found empty hands. I think that's when I realized how a promise can change the shape of your life. You can mean a thing and still be trapped by it. You can speak a name and hand it over. You can tell a story and find it told back to you in someone else's voice. They had picked a piece, and in picking it, they had handed me a ledger entry. Keeper. The word balanced on my tongue like a coin. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When morning came, it felt like an apology the world could no longer keep. Marcus was gone in a way that left a small, tidy absence. No pack, no boots, a trail that dissolved like chalk into river rock. Owen said he'd last seen Marcus at the creek, staring into the water as if someone had written him a letter he couldn't refuse. Ben sat across the table with the watch in his hand and the look of a man who had counted every coin he owned and found them all owing. We did what people do when the ledger of a small town turns ugly. We searched. For 2 days, we drove logging roads and walked game trails with flashlights that bled into dawn. We asked neighbors who answered with averted eyes and the same few phrases. He was a good boy. Some things happen up there. You know how the mountain is. Evelyn came with us the third day and walked without complaint, her joints knuckling like a carpenter's. She had that old woman's patience, like the kind born from decades of keeping track. On the third night, we found Marcus's last point of footprints at the base of Widow's Shelf, a low cliff where the laurel grows thick and the rock laughs when rain comes. They led to a shallow cave you might miss if you weren't looking for it. Inside, someone had laid out more coins, a child's cap, a brass whistle split in two. The coins were stamped with faces no one at the county courthouse could place. Someone had used a charcoal stick, a kitchen match, to etch our names on the cave's wall. Jonah, Ben, Owen, Marcus. Beneath each name, there was a thin white smear, exactly like the marks on the ring. Ben collapsed into the leaf litter and sobbed until his chest shook like a loose bell. "We didn't do it right," he kept saying. "We didn't tell it right." Owen, who had been the quietest, faced the wall and traced Marcus's name with his finger. His hand shook the way trees do in wind. "We leave it alone," Evelyn said finally, and her voice carried the weight of the years she'd kept vigil. "You told it. You made it listen. It will remember you now." That night, we took turns keeping watch in the camper. The watch Ben had left on the stump ticked in the dark like a small, nervous animal. I slept badly, the mark on my wrist prickling as if it knew the shape of a sentence I hadn't yet said. In the dream, the hollow spoke through the static of a radio. "Keep the tale, keep the order, name the name." I woke with my throat full of words I couldn't arrange. Owen left at daybreak. He said nothing. No note, no pack. He kissed Evelyn on the forehead as if she were a sister and stepped into the woods without looking back. I watched him go and felt like a man watching his own shadow leave first. Ben didn't last 2 weeks. In the end, it was simple and stupid. A fall from the truck while he was unloading the old tackle box. A local called it an accident. I called it a closing balance. At his funeral, everyone said he'd always had a gentle face. He was buried with his grandfather's watch clipped to his shirt. When they lowered the casket, the watch glass fogged and then cleared. The hands were stopped at the same minute Marcus had vanished. No one spoke of the coincidence. In Quail's Hollow, people learned to avoid naming the ledger loud enough for the mountain to hear. That left me with the mark on my wrist and the leftover things. Marcus's whistle, Owen's scrap of map, Ben's watch boxed and silent on my shelf. I tried to be practical. I tried to move on. I posted a video about Hollow Ridge, edited and careful, that got a fraction of the views I expected. The comments were a mixture of the bored, the superstitious, and the mean. One said, "Fake." Another, "Cool cinematography." A handful of accounts asked where the ring was, where they could go to see. I answered politely, as if the world had not shifted under my feet. The Hollow wants the right telling. It wants its debts remembered the way a father wants his name said correctly. After Ben died, I realized the compulsion I'd been fighting wasn't just memory. It was a machine that required feedstock, story, precisely shaped. When I told it sloppily, men went missing. When I told it with care, honoring the names in the order the Hollow liked, laying out the offerings with the correct breath, the mountain stilled a little, as if satisfied. So I did what I had to. I became itinerant. I told the story over bars I'd never entered before, and in lecture halls where the tech crew rolled their eyes. I told it to small audiences and to the mic of my channel until the video's timestamp was a ledger of its own. Each telling required a piece. Sometimes Ben's watch would be there in the frame, on a stump. Sometimes it was a whistle or a coin. People would leave things at the edges of the clearing, a rusty key, a child's toy, things they thought were cheap offerings. The Hollow did not judge the value the way humans do. It judged the fidelity of the telling. With each performance, my wristline lightened or darkened in ways I couldn't predict. The mark would sting when I lied, or when I exaggerated for effect. I learned to be precise. I learned to let the moment of fear speak and then step aside while it completed itself. The viewers liked the authenticity. The numbers went up. The Hollow listened. It learned my voice. Every so often, in the rearview mirror of my van at 2 a.m., I would think I saw Marcus walking a county road, his step too steady and his eyes a little too bright. Once in a crowd at an outdoor fair, I caught someone with a face like his profile, and when I looked away, the shape dissolved into a man with no name. I learned that the hollow could copy the living like someone reciting lines, and it liked to practice. People asked me why I kept telling the story if it cost so much. They asked why I didn't walk away, throw the watch into the river, burn the footage, and let the ledger close. The answers are messy: fear, stubbornness, pride. But the truest reason is this. If I stopped, someone else would have to tell what we had seen, and the hollow does not like a gap in its memory. It will take what it must to make sure no ledger line goes unread. I cannot ask names to do what my own mouth has bound me to do. Sometimes the price is small. A night's sleep that tastes of iron, a dream of hands arranging millet. Sometimes the price is vast, a friend who didn't find his way back from a creek. Each time I told it right, the hollow let the world ease a fraction. A creek stop acting like a creek, a dog coming home. And then, when I thought the account balanced, it would name someone else in a whisper I couldn't ignore. A face, a child's laugh on my mind. Sometimes it named listeners, not friends. Once I told a crowd in a college auditorium, and afterward a woman in the front row looked at me and said, "You said my brother's name." I had not. The hollow has ways of distributing memory like a debt check, and the bank is indifferent. There is a lastness to things that we are taught to fear, the snapping of a twig in a dark wood, the shiver at the base of a neck. But the quiet thing the hollow taught me is that endings are negotiable. Names have a persistence that will outlast bone. The mountain wants to be remembered and will choose a medium for remembering. I became one of those media. The last time I went back to the ring, I went alone. The white smears seemed softer, like old scars that had been washed. I left Marcus's whistle on the flat stone, folded Ben's watch into a small cloth, and said the words, names, times, the exact order of events, until my throat burned. The hollow listened like an elder who had patience for detail. When I finished, I placed my hand on the stone. The mark on my wrist cooled. Then it spoke its last thing to me in a voice I could not transcribe. It said simply, "Keeper." Not an assignment, not a sentence, a designation. The word settled into me like a seed that refuses the winter. If you are listening to this, if you have watched one of the videos where my voice sounds tight and honest, understand this. The story does more than tell, it binds. When you remember, when you repeat the tale, you lend it a voice the hollow can keep. Remember wrong, and people vanish. Remember right, and the hollow will breathe a little easier. I tell you this not as a warning you can act on. The mountain is not negotiable to those who have not been marked, but as a record, as my account. I keep telling because the hollow asked me to, and because, in strange and small mercies, telling saves the ones it names from being folded wholly into the dark. It keeps them as memory rather than absence. There is no justice in it, only balance. If you ever come to Hollow Ridge, and I hope you never do, leave nothing and take less. A quiet step, a name left unspoken. If you hear a finger point where there should be only trees, listen to your bones before you answer. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Jonah Hale. I was 32 the night it happened, October 14th, 2016. And I still say the date like a warning, because once you pin a day down, it stops being an accident and becomes a story you owe to the people who didn't hear the warning when it mattered. You should know, first, where this took place. Not a national park with ranger stations and paved pullouts, but a crooked seam of Appalachia the maps call Black Laurel Ridge. A handful of switchbacks, 2 lonely hollows, and a mile of road that might as well be a memory. Folks in the nearest town, Whitlock, called the place Cain's Fork. Older people there gave me names with soft smiles and sharp eyes: Old Harlan's Bend, the Witch Pine, the Hollow of the Lost Well. Names that hang on to you. I didn't go there because I liked names. I went because my brother Evan had gone there and never come back. Before I tell you the things that happened, the sounds and the scraping at the window and the hollow-eyed things moving between rhododendron, I have to introduce the company I kept and the reasons men end up where they shouldn't. I'm a carpenter by trade, not a hunter, not a wilderness man. I grew up in a house with a sagging porch and a father who taught me to keep my hands busy and my excuses shorter. Evan, my brother, was the kind of man who wore trouble like a coat. He had a grin that made doors open, a temper that closed the doors he didn't like, and a fascination with the places people told him not to go. We had friends in common and friends we chose separately. There was Eli Boone, 6 foot, quiet as a stopped clock, always the first to notice a fox on the ridge. He'd been working the late shift at the gas station in Whitlock for years and knew every back road like the lines on his palm. Then there was Marcy Lane, who grew up on the other side of Whitlock and would argue a point until the point apologized. She had an old Jeep, a taste for alone music, and a map you couldn't fold without asking permission. Tom Groves, Tommy to everyone, had a laugh that came out of his belly and a knapsack full of things no one asked for. A hand lens, a rope, a pocket knife that had saved his thumb more than once. We were a ragtag crew with mismatched reasons to hunch into the cold. Half of us drank too much beer and told better lies than the weather predicted. Half of us wanted to prove something to somebody, to parents, to lovers, to the empty air. Evan wanted to prove there were still places left that hadn't been caged by convenience. He believed that people who feared the dark had never been properly alone with it. We left Whitlock the week before the first frost. The air had that brittle sweetness of a late autumn night, like an apple someone had forgotten in their coat. Evan said he was scouting a place for a cabin. He'd been talking about a cabin for 2 years, and he liked to say he was laying claim to the land with a shout and a 6-pack. He had this notebook, leather and frayed, full of the sort of scraps that make up plans, sketches of foundation stones, lists of tools, grocery tallies, and in a corner, a few lines of some old poem about listening to the mountain breathe. Before we climbed Black Laurel Ridge, old Maggie in Whitlock gave us a warning, wrapped like a seed pod. She couldn't remember exactly why she hated that piece of ridge. A man in a bar, a missing hound, a night she had spent with wolves in the trees. But she said, "You mark my words. There's a way the mountain keeps things. You take in what don't belong to you. It remembers." We laughed at Maggie because people like Maggie are paid to be larger than life in small towns. But her eyes flicked to Evan and lingered like a sentence that wanted to finish itself. Evan slapped the bar with his palm and said, "We won't take nothing but pictures." He had this habit of promising things he intended to forget. We stocked the Jeep with the basics, then the gear that makes a man believe he'll be comfortable in discomfort. Sleeping bags, 2 lanterns, a couple of cheap folding chairs, canned beans rusty from the shelf, and a thermos. Evan insisted on bringing his father's old 30-30, the kind with a wooden stock smoothed by hands that had used it for more than sport. He said it made him feel like the land was negotiable. I remember thinking then that it was some sort of comfort talisman, not the thing that would make the mountain listen. We hiked to a spot where a stone wall curled like a broken rib and set our camp near a hollow that older maps labeled with a single underlined word: well. There are wells everywhere in the mountains. Sometimes they are actual wells, sometimes they are memorials, sometimes just depressions drenched in an old story. This one had a ring of moss and a wooden cross half buried at its shoulder. Marcy named the cross the Toothpick and dared the rest of us to polish it in the morning. We laughed and drank and let the fire dictate the stories we told. Exaggerations of past ruin, bravado meant to stitch the men together. The first night, we slept like people who have not yet given up on the world. If you're keeping track, that's the plotting, the set, the cast. There's a history to the ridge we were walking into, mining scars, a handful of attempted homesteads, and a rumor that the old Cherokee footpath that cut through there had never been properly cleared by time. The locals called it a seam of particular quiet. Animals avoided it, the radio didn't work, and on some nights the wind made sounds like soft human breath. We took all of that like a handful of coin you throw in a wishing well, promising more than the gesture could buy. Now, and I mean now, when the weather had cooled and the laughter had left the circle and been taken by the night like it was a necessary fare, the real story begins. We woke on the second morning to a silence the fire didn't want to speak through. It wasn't the common quiet that settles when everyone is asleep. It was an attention like the earth had narrowed its eyes. The dogs back in Whitlock would have been uneasy that morning. Evan said he felt it too. He paced along the tree line and chewed a strip of tobacco without taste, listening as if he could hear the mountain clearing its throat. Tom swore he saw movement in the low rhododendron, a shape that stepped where no shape should. Marcy joked, said it was just a deer, and for a while we snarled at the idea with the grace of people who can still laugh off bad omens. By noon, we found a cave mouth swallowed by ferns, and that's where Evan wanted to go. He said it was a place with good bones for a foundation, a ledge with the right kind of rock, and a view that made a man feel like he owned a horizon. I said no at first. Something about the cave felt like a breath held too long. But Evan had this way of turning a no into a dull acceptance. He asked forgiveness instead of permission, and our group shrugged into the omission. We shouldn't have gone down into the cave. We should have left the stone ring by the well alone. We should have listened to old Maggie. But I am telling you all of this, so when you hear what came next, you will know the shape of where we started from, and you'll understand what we lost in the dark that followed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When you say next, you mean hurry me on, like a man nudging the fire with a stick because he can't stand the snap. But there's no hurrying what's already been broken. I'll tell you plainly what happened after we found the cave mouth, how the night rearranged itself so that we didn't know which way was home, and what the mountain took from us while we argued about plans and blame. Evan went in first. He had that way of moving like someone who belongs to the dark. He could find a cleft in a cliff like a dog finds a bone. The others hung back. Eli with his hands in his pockets trying to make his quiet mean something useful. Tom with his knapsack slung over one shoulder as if rope and pocket knife could stitch up the world. Marcy with her Jeep keys jangling like a nervous metronome. I remember the light from Evan's lantern caught on a wet stone and split into something that looked like quicksilver. He waved us on with that grin, the one that could make any honest man a liar for a little while. The cave wasn't deep at first. A throat of shadow that ended in a low room where the floor sloped away into older, colder dark. The air had a taste I can't describe. Not quite the smell of damp rock, not quite the iron of rust, but the sense of a thing that had been waiting. The walls were marked, not by pick or pickaxe, but by something that scratched and pressed. Lines that looked like tally marks, slow and patient. In one place, someone, or something, had gouged a circle, and inside that circle had pressed a hand so hard, the stone held the shape like a fossil. We brushed our palms across it, and the rock felt neither warm nor cold. It felt aware. Evan found a little ledge that would have made a fine spot for a foundation. He crouched and ran a hand across it, muttering measurements and stones and whatnot. He took a final look at us and said, "This'll do." He laughed, the laugh that says you're going to do something foolish and you know you are, and then he climbed deeper. We should have stopped. We didn't. The light receded and left a thread of darkness. We all felt it, like a hand lowering over a lamp. Tom went after Evan. Eli wanted to follow him. Marcy hesitated. I remember thinking then that I had a choice, to be brave for my brother or to be stupid with him. I chose the first because the second would have served no better a story to tell our parents. We walked single file down a crooked incline where small stones rolled underfoot, and my lungs began to complain as if the mountain were asking permission to breathe me in. There were footprints in the fine dust, not ours. They were too small in some places, too long in others, as if whatever walked there had changed its feet depending on the slope. At one bend I found Evan's corded hat snagged on a jut of rock, collar turned inside out. Marcy picked it up. There was a smear of something on the brim that made her face go pale. "Blood?" she asked, and the syllable left the cave like smoke. We split then in that old human way. Two go looking, two stand guard because standing still feels like a plan. Eli and Tom pressed on. I waited with Marcy at a place where the cave opened to a hollow. We could hear beneath the slow drip of water and the shift of stone, a faint sound like someone dragging a limb or pulling something heavy across a floor. I wanted to say Evan, but it would have been a prayer with no deity. Tom came back first. His jaw was set. He wiped a hand across his face and said, "I saw his footprints, then nothing, like they just stopped." He held up his lantern. The light trembled. Eli wasn't with him. We called Eli, shouted until the sound hit the stone and ricocheted back like bad news. No answer. Tom wanted to go back in. Marcy said we should go up and find the road. I thought about that. The idea of leaving this place to itself felt like cowardice until it became the only way to keep from becoming something the mountain could keep. But Evan still might be there. Eli might be there. We argued until our mouths were dry. In the end, we made a circle by the cave mouth and burned what little fire we could coax from damp sticks. The world outside had become a bowl of black glass. The trees stood like quiet jurors. We rationed the last of the beans and passed around the 30-30 like a talisman. Evan's absence sat heavy between us, a physical thing you could step around if you had the courage. Marcy kept the hat on her lap and stroked it like a cat. Night is a clever thief. It starts with small things, the easy tableware of sleep, and trades them for silences that swell into new sounds. Around 2 a.m, I woke because something had walked the perimeter of our little camp. It wasn't a sound as much as a rearrangement of air, a mass moving through the rhododendron with the patience of a tide. Tom sat up and grabbed the rifle. He whispered my name, and his voice was less sharp than I expected. "Jonah," he said. "You hear that?" I did. It was a pattern of steps, not human, in rhythm, not animal in cadence. It made no direct approach. Instead, it circled the light, coming close enough that the hairs on my arms rose, then retreating as if to savor the reaction. Once it paused, and there was a soft sniffing noise like someone reading the air. The sound came from the side of the hollow where the stone ring sat, the old well. Marcy handed me the hat. "Take it," she said. "If it's Evan..." Her voice ended like a thread. We leaned on the rifle because it was a thing both practical and superstitious. Tom crawled toward the well, his boots barely making a sound on the moss. We saw his shadow pool against the rock, 2 dark shapes like a bad dream doubled. Then Tom called out, a sharp sound. "Eli?" Nothing. Tom moved closer to the well and shone his light inside. The beam caught on something at the bottom, a flash of cloth. He reached in with a stick. The stick came back wet and beaded with mud, and there was a page stuck to it. A page torn from Evan's leather notebook. Tom cradled it and read. His face folded in ways I wouldn't wish in a man. He handed it to me. Evan's handwriting was small and slanting, the kind that fills margins and skips letters. The words were half finished, as if he had been interrupted. There was a sentence, half inked and half torn away, and then, in a darker hand that might have been himself or might have been the mountain's ink, 3 words. "Do not follow." At that moment, the air changed. The sniffing stopped. The silence that followed was thick enough that I could taste the iron again. Tom looked at us, and in his eyes I saw the thing men see when they must make a choice between being brave and being wise. He whispered, "We leave at first light. No more going in." We kept watch until dawn with the burned-out light of people who have been given too many reasons to worry. The morning didn't come like a promise. It came like a verdict. We made a list of the things to do. Go to town, call the sheriff, tell the truth, and let the mountain be what it would. But when we started for the Jeep, something was wrong. Eli's knapsack lay behind a boulder where he had apparently dropped it, but there were no tracks leading away, only a scatter of prints like a child's hand, and, in places, a dragging mark that made the hair on my neck climb. We found the first clear sign of what had happened a short distance up the slope. There was a smear of blood, small and dark, and then, higher on a rock face, a handprint pressed like a warning in the mud. It was too wide for Eli, too narrow for Evan. It had been made by a palm that had 5 long, tapered fingers. But the worst of it was the angle. The handprint wasn't placed hand first. It was side first, as if whatever made it had clung to the rock like a thing that didn't walk upright. Marcy couldn't stand it. She started to cry, the sound like a hinge. Tom swore and said we would come back with help. I could smell the diesel of the Jeep like a false comfort. We drove down the ridge with the radio dead, the empty channels humming like a thought you can't finish. In Whitlock, the sheriff told us to stay calm, to preserve the scene. We left people in the hollow, men with boots and badges who promised to be careful and to call when they found anything. They called in the afternoon. Their voices were professional and slow and filled with the small tremor that tells a man lying to himself. They had found 2 more things. Eli's flashlight, crushed as if a heavy foot had broken it, and Tom Grove's. Tom was found at the lip of the cave, awake but muttering. He couldn't say where he had been, only that the dark showed him the shape of his regrets. He had claw marks on his forearms, shallow but long, and he stared at his palms like they belonged to someone else. Evan was not found. The sheriff widened the search the next day and the next, bringing in trackers and dogs and men who had spent too long training their eyes to find what others overlook. The dogs would circle the mouth of the cave, then sit and stare into the dark as if waiting for a shape to look back. They refused to go in. People in Whitlock began to tell their own stories about a settler who vanished in 1892, about a child who came back different after finding an old stone, about old Harlan who swore he saw the mountain walking in his last years. Old Maggie said nothing more than, "I told you," and sat on her porch shell-shocked in a way that looked like prayer. Evan's father came up and pressed his palm to the tree like it would return what was taken. He left with a look that made the autumn seem to fall a degree colder. As for me, I started to dream in the days that followed, not nightmares of monsters, but memories stitched on top of each other like photographs double exposed. I woke thinking I had heard Evan whistle, and then realized my ears were only hearing the night. It felt like the mountain had left a bruise over my life, and when the bruise itched, I wanted to scratch until I bled. People asked whether it was animals, whether Evan had fallen, whether he had chosen to run. I said what I knew, that the mountain had its own kinds of logic, and we had trespassed into a part of it that was both patient and clever. I will admit to you now that I also believed, in a small, honest corner, that something watched and sometimes took. Whether that thing was folklore, fear, or the consequence of old trespasses, I couldn't say. We packed Evan's things and drove home without him. We left the cave for others to mark with tape and boots. The search tapered off, as these things do, not because the mountain returned what it took, but because people have lives that need living and grief that must be put in a box and carried to the attic. They file missing person forms, they make shows on television that last 30 minutes, then they go back to work. I kept Evan's notebook page. I pressed it between two glass jars and left it on my mantle. Sometimes at night I catch myself reading those half-finished lines until sleep drifts me elsewhere. The last sentence, that final torn warning, sits in my throat like a pebble. There is more, of course. There is always more. Things that happen next tie into what happened then. Men change. The mountain does not. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The days after the sheriff's men came and left felt like wearing the same coat through 3 seasons. The stain wouldn't wash out, and every time I moved it creaked. People carried on around me like the world hadn't rearranged itself. They went to work, mowed lawns, paid bills. I learned quickly who among them could be trusted with not saying something stupid about Evan, and who couldn't. The ones who couldn't were easier to avoid. Tom got worse. Not at first, but like rust works on iron. He'd wake in the middle of the night sweating and whispering names that didn't belong to him. Sometimes he'd slam his fist into the wall until the knuckles bled, and then apologize to the empty air. He quit his job and took up odd labor, demolitions, hauling, anything that let him be sweaty and silent. He started keeping a pocket knife under his pillow and the rifle by the door, and sometimes, at odd intervals, he'd walk the perimeter of his trailer like he was afraid something from the trees might have learned to read maps. Marcy left Whitlock 2 months after Evan disappeared. She said she couldn't breathe the smell of the mountain anymore. She sold the Jeep for less than it was worth and drove west. I met her once after that, months later, in a bar whose name nobody would remember, and she rubbed at the place behind her ear where someone had once gripped her and laughed like a woman who had learned how to be small so grief could overlook her. She sent me postcards that were never postmarked, her handwriting sometimes blurred like rain. Me? I did the thing men do when guilt finds a house in their chest. I tried to fix it with action. I went back to the ridge 3 times. The sheriff, poor man, shook his head and said, "You're only hurting yourself." But he also couldn't stop the itch in his fingers. He came once with tracking dogs and asked the trees to tell him what they'd seen. The dogs sat and refused to enter the cave mouth, and the sheriff ordered the teams back. The logbooks closed with emptiness where a man's fate should be. On the 3rd return trip, I went alone. People in Whitlock muttered about that like it was a sin they'd feel better about if spoken aloud. I took Evan's notebook page from the glass jars and slipped it into my pocket. The page had started to peel at the edges. The ink had bled in places like it was reluctant to be read. Those 3 words, "do not follow," felt less like a command and more like a dare. I drove until the air got thin with pine and left the Jeep on a shoulder where the road remembered it had once been paved. Walking up Black Laurel Ridge alone is a different thing than walking with a rope of friends. The steps don't echo when you go by yourself. You are your own curiosity and your own caution. The mountain watched me like a patient thing, and the hollow where we'd set camp looked smaller, meaner than my memory had made it. The stone ring at the well had been scoured by rain and time. Someone or something had left fresh scratch marks along its lip. I couldn't stop studying those scratches. They weren't animal, they were deliberate. At the lip lay 2 things: a child's shoe the size of my palm, leather cracked and a small buckle still attached, and a strip of red cloth. The shoe lay as if dropped in a hurry and forgotten. I picked it up and my hands remembered how small things feel when they belong to a person they used to belong to. The leather smelled faintly of rot and something else I couldn't place at first, the cold, wet breath of the cave. I found footprints in the mud beyond the well that made no sense. They were not always the same width, and some were half prints like whoever walked there had been wearing different feet. Sometimes the step broke into small, neat depressions like the tread of a child's sandal. Other prints were long and splayed, as if the walking thing had stretched itself thin to slide between rocks. The pattern led deeper into the pines and then stopped at a stand of rhododendron where the air grew suddenly colder. That's when the voice came. It wasn't a voice like a man speaks. It was a sound that saddled the back of your neck and rode up into your skull. Half whisper, half wind. I remember thinking absurdly that if I could name it, I might be able to bargain. The sound said nothing anyone could hold, only syllables that made the hair on my arms stand to attention. It sounded like my brother, not quite his tone, but the shape of his laugh wound into a warning. "Don't," it said. Or maybe it didn't say anything at all. Maybe I simply heard what I was afraid of. I answered because men answer things they shouldn't. "Evan?" The word left me small and foolish in the trees. The reply was a shift of dirt and a soft scrape like fingernails on stone. Then, unmistakably, my name. "Jonah," it breathed, and it was a sound like snow falling on a roof. Patient. Inevitable. I ran. I don't know why. I ran because standing there felt like agreeing to a thing I couldn't forgive myself for. I cut through the rhododendron and came out onto a slope that hadn't been there on my other trips. The land was treacherous in that way the mountain likes. Angles that are not angles, dips that are shallow but swallow a man whole. A chill moved through me, deeper than weather. I thought of Tom and Eli and Evan and the half-lives their names had become. That night I slept in my truck at the edge of town, the engine left idling like a little defiance. I dreamed of the cave. In the dream there was a room with a low ceiling and a light like early morning but without warmth. In the center of the room stood a figure that was not quite a person. It was too thin in places, too broad in others, as if it could compress and stretch to fit whatever hole you were inclined to climb into. It held something in its hands, a notebook, the leather familiar to me because I'd held it, because Evan had owned it. The figure turned, and its face was a shadow with the memory of a face inside, like a silhouette holding a photograph. It opened the notebook, and under the light, the pages were blank, but for those 3 words I knew by heart. I woke choking as though I'd inhaled the whole cave. After that, I wasn't the same man. I took to checking doors twice. I kept Evan's rifle at my bedside and learned how to clean it with a kind of devotion a man usually reserves for less frightening rituals. I called the sheriff every few days, not because I'd expected news, but because the act of calling made me feel like I was not the only person mourning a thing that ought to be found. The sheriff's voice was always steady, like someone reciting a poem he didn't believe, and his promises were thin. "We'll keep the teams up in rotation," he'd say. "We'll put more men on it if anything new turns up." A month later, I got a call from Whitlock that woke me as if someone had turned the lights on. "Jonah," the sheriff said. "We found something up by the old switchback. You need to come up." By the time I got there were more people than I'd expected. Men with boots like small, hard statements. Aunt Lily from down the county who always smelled like baking. And Tom, standing at the edge of the gathered circle with his shoulders hunched as if he had been folded wrong. Tom's eyes were glassier than I remembered. They had found a stone, a marker of sorts, half buried and wrapped in roots. When they dug it up, the stone had been inscribed with a date, one from long before Evan's time, and with names that could have belonged to settlers, to children, to anyone you meet on a porch. Buried beneath that slate, they had found a small tin, the kind a man puts match heads in, and inside the tin was a scrap of paper. On that paper were two things: a tiny, careful footprint traced in ink and a line of handwriting that made the blood drain from my face. The line read, "We traded the way the mountain asked." Tom turned his head when he saw me. His mouth moved like a man set to ask a question, but forgot the one that mattered most. "We should go back," he said. "All of us. Find out what it wants." The crowd murmured. Some people thought Tom had finally gone too far. Others, those who'd seen the way the mountain made eyes hollow, nodded like people deciding to give their cattle away to save them. I felt the old dare, the 3 words pressed into my ribcage, and a decision unstitched itself. I was going back, whether I wanted to or not. The mountain had a habit of making decisions for men. We planned in the ways men who are afraid and practical plan. Ropes, more lanterns, food, radios, and a priest from Whitlock who'd come because he believed in attending to souls even in places where the land was not kind. The thing we did not prepare for was the way our hearts had already been measured by something older than maps and laws. We were men with ghosts. We were men with a purpose that might well be its own undoing. We left at dawn. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We left Whitlock before dawn, with the kind of quiet that pretends to be courage. 5 of us in 2 trucks. Tom with his pocket knife and the rifle he couldn't stop cleaning. The sheriff in boots that had seen more than one dark thing and refused to be surprised. The priest, Father McCall, who smelled faintly of smoke and soap and said little but held a small wooden cross in his hand. Marcy, who had come back because some things follow you until you answer, and me with Evan's torn notebook page in my pocket. We took radios that hissed and went dead when asked for real comfort, ropes, extra lanterns, and the kind of resolve that has the quality of armor and the brittleness of tin. The road up Black Laurel Ridge had the same blind turns and potholes it always did, but there was something different in the light. The trees seemed to lean away from the hollow, and the crows were absent, circling absent birds of a different sort. We parked where we always had and walked the rest of the way, boots sinking into a soil that tasted like old rain. The stone ring by the well looked smaller, more ashamed, as if the ground itself had tried to cover it after whatever bargain had been struck. We moved carefully, speaking in whispers, because sound seemed to travel wrong there, sliding into people's ears and making them confess things they would rather remember. Father McCall led with a lantern and a rosary clenched in his fist. If the mountain heard the clack of rosary beads, it paid little mind. Tom's hands shook when he lit his lamp. Marcy had her Jeep keys wrapped around her wrist like a rosary of her own. The cave mouth swallowed us faster than my memory had expected. Down inside, each step took us away from the sky and closer to answers we had been afraid to ask. The walls remembered our breath and turned it back at us like a mirror. At one point, Tom stopped and pressed his palm to the stone. "It knows we're here," he whispered. "It knows us." We came upon the low room, the place I had dreamed of and wished I had never seen. The air was colder than it should have been, and there at the center sat a shape as small as it was wrong. A stone altar leaned against an older stone, and on its surface lay Evan's leather notebook. The cover was cracked and the pages were ruffled, as if someone had been reading and crying at the same time. Around the altar, the floor bore tracks. Too many kinds, to be honest, some like child's feet, some long and splayed, some like a man who had walked on the sides of his hands. "Evan?" I called, my voice making the stone tremble like a small animal. For a moment, the cave offered nothing but the slow drip in our feet. Then, a noise, not quite a voice, like a page turned in the dark. He was there, but not as I had ever expected to see him. Evan crouched beside the altar, knees tucked in, a blanket of moss wrapped around his shoulders. His hair had grown thin in places where the light had never reached, and his hands trembled with the kind of patient steadiness that belongs to men who have given up counting days. He looked at us, and in his eyes, my brother's eyes, Something had settled that made them older than the years. "Jonah," he said, and it was his voice, but also a note beneath the voice, like an echo picked up from farther back. He smiled, the small, crooked smile that had once charmed the world to his feet, and it did not reach his hands. We rushed to him. Tom nearly tripped over a jut of rock. Marcy fell to her knees and threw her arms around Evan like she was trying to hold him in place against the tide. Father McCall stood back and made a small sign of the cross and then another, as if he did not trust one to be enough. "What happened?" I demanded, the words sharp like stone. "Where were you?" Evan's laugh was small and wet. He touched the notebook and traced a page with a finger. The ink smudged under his nail, but the letters stood stubborn. He said, "It asked for a traitor." The sheriff cursed under his breath. "A what?" "A traitor," Evan said again. "Something back before settlers and before most names. The mountain keeps accounts the way men keep lists. Once, someone signed on a ledger with the thing that you are. A child. A promise. It remembers those bargains. I found the ledger and I read the names." He told us in fragments, things that stitched together like a quilt, patched with regret. Years ago, when the settlers first carved at the ridge, there had been a series of small, desperate trades. A tin with a footprint inside, a marker with names, a child's shoe. Those who left things on the altar believed they were bargaining for mercy, for water, for a safe path, for the quieting of a cough. The mountain took what it wanted in return. Sometimes it took a sickness, sometimes a crop, sometimes a life. The old markers recorded payments, and the mountain remembered the balance. Evan had been greedy in the way of men who think bargains are meant to be read like recipes. He had gone further into the ledger. He had seen the writing. We traded the way the mountain asked and misread it as a promise he could circumvent. The mountain, he said, offered him a choice. Leave alone and it would take someone else from his fold, or stay and become a thing that watches. It did not offer violence in the manner of a thief. It offered a kind of keeping. Stay and you would not leave. Stay and you would remember for those who could not. Stay and you would become a ledger entry with a name. Evan's hands shook when he spoke. "I thought I could bargain with it," he said. "I thought being the one it took would make the rest of you safe. I thought if I gave it me, it would be content." We heard the hollow honesty in that and the selfishness that sometimes lives under the excuse of sacrifice. Marcy cried then, soft, grief-laced sobs, and the sheriff cursed at the ceiling. Tom's hands went to his face and left red marks like a man trying to scrub memory away. "What do you mean become?" Father McCall asked. "Evan, what did they do to you?" Evan smiled again, the small crooked thing I remembered, and shook his head slowly. "It didn't do anything to me that looks violent. It pulled my things into the dark and showed me a ledger and the names. It showed me the child's shoe and the tin and the scrap of paper. It showed me whose names were spoken loudly and whose were whispered. And then it offered me a place where I could keep watch so it didn't take anyone else for a while." "You accepted?" I heard myself ask, my voice a blade. He nodded. "I accepted. I thought I could bargain for time. I thought I could be better than the ledger. I thought I could." He couldn't finish. He looked at each of us in turn like a man who had been given the form of a life and found it hollow. "The mountain does not forgive debts," he said. "It collects them. If I stay, it keeps someone else for a while. If I leave, it takes what it wants. You can't out-bargain a mountain, Jonah. Father McCall crossed himself with more fervor than I had ever seen. "Then you must come with us," he said. "We can get you help. Real help." Evan's head tilted the way it had when he listened to the wind as a child. "Help," he repeated. "Help from what? The sheriff? A doctor? They don't see the lists, they can't read the ledger. Only this place can keep the record straight." For a long time, no one spoke. The cave hummed with the slow, indifferent drip of water and something else. A sound like pages turning, like a book being closed and opened again. And "What did you sign?" Tom asked finally, and his voice came out like a plea. Evan reached into his pocket and pulled out the half-torn page I had seen before, now whole enough to read with a clarity that made my throat close. In a careful hand, faded but legible, were names, long lists of them, and at the bottom, in a darker ink, those words, "Do not follow." He had added, lower and slanted, his own handwriting. "I wrote it because I thought if I could warn you, you would stop. I thought I could make a circle of people who knew and so keep the mountain patient. I was wrong. Marcy's hands went to her mouth. Then what do we do? We can't leave you here. The sheriff's face made a motion like a man calculating risk and loss. This is beyond law. If what he says is true, then the only thing we can do is choose not to feed it more names. Not feeding it names means leaving it what it already has, Father McCall said, and his voice had the tiredness of a man who had learned the hard edges of prayer. Evan stood. He seemed smaller then, like a man who had been carved by weather and the years. I am going to stay, he said simply. I am not being noble. I am not being brave. I am tired. I don't want to be a list item that makes people feel better about the balance. I am choosing this. Tom lunged as if to stop him, but Evan put a hand on his shoulder, the same hand that once slapped a six-pack on a bar, and smiled the crooked smile that had once convinced me to follow him into better and worse nights. Forgive me, he said. Forgive me for being foolish. Forgive me for thinking I could outsmart an old book. We argued then, quietly, desperately. There were words about rescue and therapy and a plan that involved shining light into the ledger and reading it like scripture. There were also the ugly, honest things. That sometimes sacrifice is a word we use to make sense of cowardice. That sometimes staying is the only true thing a man can do when he is finished pretending he can fix everything. In the end, we left Evan in the cave, wrapped in moss and the thin blanket he had taken for warmth. He pressed his palm to the stone altar like a man taking an oath, and Father McCall blessed him with a hand that trembled. We left his notebook on the altar and turned to the light. Outside, the morning air felt like a small mercy. Tom walked with his head down. Marcy held my arm and refused to let me go. The sheriff said little, but his jaw worked as if he had something like a prayer on the tip of it. We drove down Black Laurel Ridge with less noise than we had come up, the radio alive with static that sounded for a while like a choir. At the edge of Whitlock, people were waiting, whispering, but when they saw Evan not beside us, they fell silent in ways that were almost compassionate. I have been asked since whether I regret it, whether I think we failed Evan by leaving him. I have been asked if the mountain took him because we could not stand the sight of what he had become. I have been asked if, on some nights, I think we made things worse by keeping the ledger unread, by letting a secret live so long it hardened into myth. I do not know, in the way men with bones and debts know anything. I know only this. Evan kept his promise in the way that mattered to him. He charted the ledger in his mind and put himself where it could reach him, and not us. The mountain did not roar or spit when we left. It watched, patient as always. It had a balance as indifferent as gravity. Years have passed. Tom moved away and calls sometimes in a voice that is softer now. Marcy sends postcards that never arrive. The sheriff retired with a quiet that sounded like resignation. Father McCall died 2 winters later, and at his funeral, men whispered about curses and faith in the same quiet. As for me, I keep Evan's notebook page under glass on my mantle so that when I wake in the middle of the night, I can read the hand that told me not to follow and remember that some balances must be tipped by those who hold them willingly. People still walk the ridge. Old Maggie still sits on her porch and scolds the world. Whitlock still has a bar with a jukebox playing songs that taste like coin. And the mountain, Black Laurel Ridge, Cain's Fork, the hollow of the Lost Well, still keeps its list. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is thin, I hear a sound like a page turning, and I think of Evan bent over a stone reading a ledger the way other men read newspapers. I do not know whether that is comfort or grief. If you ever find yourself near a place that hums like an old ledger, where wells have rings of moss and stones that look like bones, remember, some bargains were made before your name was written. Some places keep accounts in ways that men do not understand. Heed the torn pages. Listen to the people who say, do not follow. Take the warning as you will. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.